Are you ready to explore exciting careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies? Then join me, your podcast host, Dr. Milena Krastenskaya, or simply Dr. K, and my amazing guests on the Neurocareers Doing the Impossible podcast. Discover what it takes to turn the impossible into reality. Tune in now to a thrilling episode number 31. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, welcome to another exciting adventure into the world of careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Andreas Forsland, a visionary leader and innovator in the world of assisted reality. As the founder and CEO of Cognixion, Andreas is at the forefront of developing cutting-edge technology that blends the power of brain-computer interfaces with augmented reality displays. With a mission to make the future of assisted reality universally accessible, his company is addressing the needs of millions of people with complex disabilities and has been recognized as top 21 neurotech startup to watch. Get ready to be inspired as Andreas takes us on a journey of innovation and progress with Cognixion. He will be sharing his valuable insights and the key to success, his unique mindset that drives him to change the world for the better. Welcome, Andreas. It's such a pleasure to have you today on our podcast. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Milena. This is great. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. And can you give us a quick introduction about yourself and let our listeners know where you are joining us from and share any interesting facts or information about the place you live in?
Wonderful. Yes. So my name is Andreas. I am coming to you from Santa Barbara, California, which is in between Los Angeles and San Francisco along the central California coast. Cognixion, we are headquartered in Santa Barbara, but we also have offices in Toronto, Ontario, and we also employ individuals all around the country.
Yeah, thank you so much. Speaking about Santa Barbara, it reminded me about the first TV shows that I've ever seen in my life. Because I lived in a former Soviet Union. I lived in Lithuania, which now is part of Europe. But when I was growing up, we didn't have this long TV series. And after the Soviet Union broke, all these possibilities started coming in, and the first TV series was Santa Barbara.
I remember that show. I think you'd have to go on YouTube now to see it was a while ago, but yeah, it was very fantastic. And there is some truth in that series in how it is here in Santa Barbara, but generally it's a really livable, accessible city for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And as we went to that plane into the past, maybe you can tell us, what did you want to be when you were growing up?
You know, when I was growing up, I was a bit of a quiet kid. I spent a lot of time drawing and imagining things and playing with like action figures and things. And so I had quite a very creative imagination when I was young, but I was also very quiet. So I tended to observe things around me. So thinking about understanding how the wind worked and, could you see invisible things like the wind? And you realize you couldn't see the wind. You could only see the things that the wind was blowing around, right? And understanding, later on, now that I'm an adult, thinking back, those were the early days of developing my skills and my senses for pattern recognition. Yeah. And so for a long time, I've always sort of been thinking about pattern recognition as a child. But I also wanted to get into expression. So I used art as a means for expression, design, sculpting, and then also other kinds of things. Sport. So I used to snowboard and skateboard as a child. And so I tended to look at those types of sports, not as recreation, but as a means for like dance or ballet. It's like you would kind of express yourself through movement and taking great pride in, becoming good at that. My background when I went to the university was design. So I chose to go into the field of design, specifically visual communications. So visual communications at that time was really kind of a gateway into two careers. One career would be advertising and marketing, or the other career, which I graduated university in 95. That was right at the very beginning when the first version of the internet was really starting to explode. And so I had a choice to either go into advertising or go into digital experiences. And so I chose the latter. I chose to go into designing digital experiences. And so my first job out of college was doing a variety of things. I worked at IBM. At that time, they had a group called the Global Services Group. So IBM helped other companies figure out what they were doing with the internet, the first version of the web browser and Netscape and things like this, and the beginnings of e-commerce and so on. So I was kind of really, I started my career really on the ground floor of the internet. That was really the beginning of sort of my journey and understanding technology and what the possibilities of having an abundance of information available to you immediately through the internet with a few clicks. At that point, you realize that the very first web browser wasn't designed very well. So the user experience was always how do you improve that user experience of finding information? And that's really sort of the Web 1 experience was really around how do you get lots of information, connected and make it accessible? But it was pretty poorly designed, but the tools were what they were. So you adapt with those tools. I could talk more about sort of the progression, but I guess in my career, I've sort of worked with Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3. And so I have an opinion about sort of the history and the future of where we're all going.
Yeah, and it's so interesting what you are saying. In one of your interviews, I heard your story from the childhood when you disassembled the clock of your grandfather. Yes. But then you were able to put it together and left out the details which were not necessary. So basically optimizing the clock. And I see the same theme as you are talking about your experiences with web browsers, with the internet, when you immediately starting looking into the things that can be improved, that can be optimized user experience, optimized accessibility. So I see it as a thread actually leading even to the company you are at now, optimizing possibilities for communication for people. So, how do you see your mindset reflecting in the work you are doing right now at your current company?
It's an interesting observation that you have there. And you might even think that applies not just to like a product, but also an industry, right? And also society to say, how do you optimize things, small and large, and understanding that there's an interconnection between the small things and the large things. So, when I started the company that is Cognixion, we were originally working on trying to find a way to help my mom communicate. So she went to the hospital and was admitted and intubated with a ventilator because of pneumonia. So she had a hard time breathing, and it was fairly advanced. So they had to go fairly invasively to help with her life support. Now, she was there for weeks, locked in her body, unable to communicate verbally, and unable to move her arms because she was restrained so that she wouldn't remove any of the life support cables to different devices. So imagine being conscious and aware, but locked in your body. So for me, that was a significant breakdown in understanding, wow, you don't know what you don't know until you're put into a situation, right? And then you have to sort of think about, well, is there anything available today that could help with the situation? And if there's not, then you're sort of left disempowered. And oftentimes that necessity is the fuel for invention. So that's really what inspired me was a personal story. She was discharged. She was able to be discharged and survived. But that impact for me was the inspiration for thinking about and research something that I didn't know anything about. Instinctively, I knew how important self-expression was, but I didn't realize how many people have trouble expressing themselves. And so if you find yourself inspired by something that you can't stop thinking about, spend time researching it and understand how many people share that problem or that breakdown. Because there's not a lot of, there wasn't a single analyst report or a single place I could go to determine how big is this market. I had to really have the passion to like try and discover and the curiosity to sort of investigate these problems and realize how prolific the problems are. Now I can say years later that our company has probably the largest data set around the market, the problem, the human factors, clinical pathologies. We understand all of the human factors needs of a great deal of individuals with a variety of disabilities. But when I started, I didn't know anything. I just had a burning interest and curiosity with a desire to try and come up with a solution. And the interesting thing was our first solution wasn't what we're doing now. It was something different. But, I think what caused me to leave my job to pursue this problem was once I realized how meaningful self-expression was and how many people were impacted by having a lack of self-expression, I really thought about this going back to my childhood, thinking about the importance of time and what you have to do in the world with the time you have. So since I was a young child, I didn't want to waste a lot of time doing things that weren't going to have meaning or make an impact. So that was sort of also my mindset, is try and spend more of your time doing things that have a ripple effect or have a legacy. So versus just chasing money or chasing jobs, find a way to have both, pursue things that do good in the world. But, we ended up building a product that was a handheld little gesture controller, like a little stone, and it could pick up your movement and over Bluetooth could pair to an app on an iPhone. And the app on the iPhone would recognize these different movement gestures and would trigger different phrases. So if I move my hand one way, it would say a phrase. If I move my hand a different way, it would say a different phrase. So that was our first attempt at solving the problem. Right. And then thinking about what you learn by iterating and building products to solve the problem and realize, well, that solved a really narrow slice of the problem. But in order for me to have a bigger impact, I needed to solve the problem differently. And so we had to sort of come back and think, oh, well, maybe it's not a handheld gesture that's going to be the thing that reaches the most people. Perhaps it's a brain computer interface, right? Like we thought, oh, well, if someone didn't have to consciously move their hand, if they could just think something and it would come out, that was me being naive. I wasn't a neuroscientist. I said, well, there's got to be a possibility, right? So I had a audacious goal that could be possible. And then we were able to take the technology we had already built for the stone, and we were able to get a consumer EEG headset and do a bunch of hacking to make it work with our software. And we were able to actually get successful, repeatable controls that replaced the hand gesture movements with thought patterns. And at that point, we were able to do about 4 or 5 unique, discrete classes or different kinds of controls. And so what we realized is that could potentially be a viable solution if we tested it. And then when we did testing, we did an IRB study with Cal Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. And they did a study with our system, and we learned a lot about what was going to be successful or not successful for a brain-computer interface that could be used for communication. And so we took that learning and we really rethought what exactly we needed to build. And that's where we arrived that we needed to absolutely have cause and effect. We had to have a closed loop system, and the value of having a very low latency, high speed system that based on what I was thinking or what I was fixated on, that you would get the biofeedback very quickly of whether you're doing it right or wrong. And if you do it right, that you get that effect of control very quickly and accurately. So having that closed loop system was critical for any BCI to work. And we learned that in 2016. And so what we realized was we had to have a system that included virtual or augmented reality and the BCI. It just had to go there. And so we didn't, I guess if you go to cognixion.com and you learn about some of the work we're doing, it might seem that we came out of nowhere and we just sort of said, hey, let's do this neat thing. But what we've created was entirely driven by following a problem and working through different solutions to get to the current solution. So, I'd sort of say anyone that's interested in working in not just neurotech, but any field, that you should figure out what problem you really want to solve and determine if it's big enough to solve many different ways and if it's worth your time and money to solve that problem. And if it is, then you should commit to it, right? And not fall in love with the solution, but fall in love with solving the problem. And so that is an optimization issue. If you think about, you're seeking to learn what you do need to do, but in the course of the process, you learn very quickly what not to do, right? So sometimes the value of knowing what not to do or what to exclude is as important, if not more important, than knowing what to do.
It reminded me of what Thomas Edison said when he was inventing light bulb. He said, I didn't fail 1,000 times. I learned 1,000 times of how not to do things.
Yeah.
So in everything we can find some learning moment. From what you said, I understood that you got that first inspiration from the case with your mom when she was unable to communicate, but then you really did this groundwork of exploring the field and looking into the extent of the problem. Can you share with our listeners this extent, which I think many people even don't realize, how many people have difficulties and problems with communication?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, so depending on, who's listening, there's different types of product development. So I was pushing really more of an agile development, iterate like very fast iterations to understand the market. And so if you think about the lowest fidelity prototype you can create is like a PowerPoint presentation with a storyboard of like still frames of a scenario. And you might sort of describe a scenario in pictures as if you're making a film, but you're sort of telling a story about the possibilities of a device, right? And so very early on, we developed those kinds of presentations and we put them onto iPads and walked up and down the street and we interviewed people. And we said, hey, we gave a bit of an overview of what do you think about this problem? What do you think about this solution? Is this something you would wear? Is this something you would pay for? Who do you think would benefit from this the most? And so this very open, curious sort of nature of providing just enough stimuli to extract really novel insights, right? Because you want to have the least investment up front to generate the greatest amount of unique, novel insights, right? So because your first product, when you're building a product, isn't the product, it's the insight. And so as a result of that, what we heard over and over again from many different people were, hey, I know someone that has cerebral palsy. Why don't you go speak to someone that has cerebral palsy? Or someone else might say, oh, well, what about special education? There are a lot of children with autism or developmental disabilities. Blah, blah, blah. So at first, we ended up getting referred to many different communities that we weren't even aware of. We went to the Braille Institute and spent time in the classroom with the blind and low vision users being taught how to use iPhones. Like, how can you use a smartphone when you can't see it? And so we got to sit and audit these classes and learn techniques for how the blind and visually impaired use smartphones. So spending a lot of time just diving into these different communities and then starting to understand how many of these communities are living sort of on the edges of mainstream society. And so what we don't realize is how many hundreds of millions of people in the world are impacted by speech or motor disabilities. Based on what we found through lots of cited research and segmentation and analysis, there's about 509 million, so 500 million people. There's over 1 billion that have a diagnosed disability worldwide. Demographers and statisticians say between 15 and 20% of the world's population has a diagnosed disability impacting vision, hearing, speech, motor, cognitive, memory, things like this. If you look at all those different specific sensory or cognitive disabilities, more than half impact movement and speech. And then when we titrate that data down into those people who are completely, say, 80 to 90% physically paralyzed in one way, or they're chronically impaired physically in some way, or their speech is generally hard to understand or non-existent. That's about 100 million people worldwide. And that excludes the deaf community. So if you think about the deaf community, most rely on sign language or other means of communication. And so sign language by itself is its own language. But oftentimes individuals who are deaf have a difficult time speaking as well. And so there's over 200 million people worldwide that are deaf and hard of hearing. And so we don't even include that in our numbers. So you think about just the magnitude of how many people around us are impacted. And you say that's a really big challenge. It's a really big challenge to say, how can you work with that many people with such a variety of physical needs and sensory needs? And what kind of solution might you want to solve for that? Well, I don't want to oversimplify our biology. It's very complex. But if you look at this simplistically and say, most of these conditions is there's an issue with your central nervous system or your peripheral nervous system. And how do you design for that? And how do you build software or sensors that can adapt and be personalized for someone's unique and very peculiar ways that their peripheral nervous system behaves? And so that's really sort of how we have looked at designing technology, is understanding how the nervous system responds to internal volitional intention or to external stimuli, and how does the body react to the world it's in, and consequently how does the mind perceive what's happening, and does it have agency to control or interact with the world in novel ways. So that's kind of the core of what we've been deeply curious about, and trying to design ways to augment someone who maybe has a peripheral system that doesn't behave the way they want it to. And often that affects speech, speech motor, physical motor, hand and arm control. And so when we look at that and say, well, there are many shades of gray, right? But if we take an extreme view and say on one end of the spectrum, we have individuals that have very spastic movement patterns. And the more that they consciously try to slow down and control the peripheral nervous system, the more out of control it becomes. So you have spasticity, which isn't just general spasticity. It's just when someone tries to slow down or control the movement, it becomes even more uncontrollable. It's a very hard problem to solve with virtual and augmented reality for people who have that kind of condition, right? On the other end of the spectrum, we have individuals who have clinically locked in state, or are like, say, late stage ALS, or have had a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. They might be in traction. These individuals might not even be able to move their eyes at all. So how can you have one system that could go as broadly to include individuals who can't even move their eyes to those who can't stop moving? And so that's been really our core design challenge, is to push in on those edge cases, which are the really difficult usability issues regarding computer control or augmented or virtual reality control. And then when you say, well, why now? Why this way? Well, you're seeing lots of momentum moving into the metaverse and into augmented and virtual reality. And the key assumption for how people are going to interact with virtual and augmented reality is what? You see me, if you're watching the video, I'm not sure if this video, but I'm moving my hands around a lot. So most virtual and augmented reality require you to use your hands. You either have to use controllers, or the next generation headsets are going to be using cameras to do gesture recognition with your hands. Well, what are people that can't lift their arms or can't manipulate their hands in a way that you and I can? How are they going to interact with virtual reality? They might not, right? They're just completely excluded. And so this gets into the future that we want to create. And Cognixion can't create it alone. Like all of your students and listeners, should start thinking about how do you make the future Web3 and even Web4, like what is the future and how can we make it much more accessible by taking an honest look at people that don't look and behave like you and I do, right? So some might say, well, you can use eye tracking. Well, eye tracking, we work with lots of people that use eye tracking. And guess what? It's really finicky and it does tend to make you very tired and fatigued if you're using only eye tracking as your only way of interacting with things. So, two strikes on mass market consumer VR and AR. Arm control and eye tracking are non starters for individuals who have trouble communicating, controlling their eyes, or moving their arms. So, if you think about that, between 100 million and 500 million people today are going to have a very big divide, right, into the digital economy, and it's like we'll have trouble getting into the metaverse. We'll have trouble getting into this new technology. And so, how can the work we're doing and possibly work of some of the listeners that you have, aim their careers at making the future much more accessible and intuitive, So that's a bit why, I'm excited about what we're doing because, we do see that 10 to 20 years from now, the world is going to look very different than it does today. What I mentioned earlier, that many of these communities that have disabilities are generally living on the fringes. We don't see very many individuals on Main Street, so to speak, at least in the United States. It might be different. It's different in other countries. But I think in 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a much more diverse community on the sidewalks and in the streets and doing things because of technologies like this.
Yeah, and this brings me to a question that I always ask in our podcasts. How do you see the future, 2050 and maybe 100 years from now? The future, maybe where neurotechnology is developed, the way it is developing right now. What would be the ideal future you would like to see?
The future I see is one where there are convergent technologies that we're paying attention to. There are certain cities and countries that are investing in some of these enabling technologies, and they have the right philosophy for why they're investing in these technologies, for how they design sort of cities of the future, including infrastructure such as 5G or 6G and ubiquitous access to internet connectivity, edge computing, wireless and wearable computing that is easy to use and feels very natural as a part of our bodies, much more prolific data and well-tagged data, thinking about objects in the real world are objects of data. So light bulbs and switches and doors and everything, really everything has an attribute. So the ability to tag everything in the world, these are things that are happening now. Having AI companionship, we learned this in COVID, where as we got further away from each other, we have a mental health care crisis that's looming, and sort of a feeling of connectedness with each other and intimacy, I think, is something that's going to be on the horizon, and these types of technologies will enable. But coming back to, I think, going back to like 1995 when I started my career, designing websites, the first websites for many corporations, it was all about how do we make it easier, right? And so if you think about the future is the things that we want to do, how we want to affect the world should become easier, right? And when we think about affecting the world, what I mean by that is we're interacting with the world today using analog methods. So interacting with the world looks like interacting with people, interacting with things, interacting with vehicles, interacting with the built environment and structures and buildings and doors and infrastructure, interacting with content, and interacting with our own data about ourselves and our biology. So do we have greater insights to be able to make choices? So I see in the next 10 to 20 years, I see a much more magical way of feeling like we can interact with each other and all of those things in our world and making it easier to do so. The challenges that I see are really around taking that too far. There are unintended consequences, and thinking about what those unintended consequences are that could happen in the future and designing for them now. So you have safety, security, privacy issues. You have social well-being issues, around your dependence on technology versus, interdependence with other humans. So I think there's a number of things that need to be addressed, not now, but over time as we start to see these examples of things like what we're doing start to show up in the world. I also think that there are huge opportunities for policy and finance at the country level, thinking about you might have tremendous economic disparity, and you're going to have a lot of people that maybe can have access to these types of technologies and other countries where they won't. And so you have this opportunity, I should say, for thinking about those things and trying to be a force for change towards making things like what we're doing more easily accessible, finding ways to make them affordable for people in different countries or in different economic strata. So there's many things that I think I call them opportunities. I mean, they're challenges, but they're also opportunities.
That's true. And speaking about the future, what is the goal of your company right now, and how do you see it changing or not changing as we're progressing in time into the future?
Well, I think that the creativity and imagination and being able to be somewhat rational in how you analyze where we are, and you can sort of predict various types of futuristic scenarios, we think pretty far out. I think what most people have a problem with, and I think a lot of people can imagine interesting futures and scenarios. I think what humans are very poor at doing is estimating how long it's going to take to get there, right? So I think what we're doing right now as a company is we're bringing technologies that are 10 to 20 years away into commercial availability today. And it's not that we're necessarily, I mean, we are pioneering science, but a lot of what we're building is built on decades of good science. You know, government and grants and public funding has supported decades of innovation in neuroscience and things like this. The problem has been that most of that science has been locked into the universities, and it's not getting transferred out into ways to commercialize it. So I think there's a bottleneck that the world is suffering for a lack of solutions, not because the ideas aren't there and because the science isn't there, but because of some public policy or tech transfer standards and guidelines or economic desires of the organizations that hold that IP, the intellectual property. There's sort of a desert of commercial opportunity and an abundance of passion and great science. And so I saw that early on. And as a designer, I'm a nonlinear thinker. And so for me, I'm able to go to a science or a neuroscience conference and be able to speak to hundreds of PhDs and look at their papers and look at the kind of things that they're studying. And I can, as a designer, I can envision a future and I can work backwards and say, these are the things that need to be in place to deliver that future. And by being able to have that vision, I can work with and identify who are those specific scientists or engineers that are passionate and working on things that are relevant for that future. So to your earlier question, it's how did I get into the industry? I didn't break into it. I walked into it with an idea that is much bigger than anything that I could do on my own, and being able to identify and build a team of people that is very diverse in skills and gender and race and nationality that could come together and build an integrated solution. Sort of that's how I've been successful so far is having a vision and being able to work with other people that can play an important part of that vision.
What was the biggest challenge from you transitioning from working for a company to creating your own company?
So this isn't my first company to start. However, the previous companies I've had were different. They were far less complex, but they were also like on the services side. So like my very first company that I've had was a consultancy. And then I had another product company, but it was far less complex. And then and then this. So I did have some history in taking risks. I think the real difference between starting a company or working for a startup or working for a big company, it goes back to your mental state, and your willingness to take a risk and what you're willing to risk to be a part of the thing that you want to do or be a part of. Most people don't have a high risk tolerance, or if they do, it's for a very limited period of time. And if you're going to start a company as an entrepreneur, you have to think about it like a marathon and not a sprint. What that means is if you're going to start a company and you really want to see it through, you have to make sure that you have the tenacity and the grit to work through that process over a long period of time. Because in this field, there's no such thing as like a quick win. There are many little quick wins, but if you're really going for a big problem, it's a longer term investment in time. Another thing that you should think about is, I sort of call it getting your house in order. So sometimes you need to just go work for some companies for a while and be really diligent about your own financial management, your financial literacy. Make sure that you're spending the least amount of money and you're saving the most amount of money and you're doing the right things to give yourself a financial cushion so that at some point when you want to go take a risk, you're more comfortable doing that. And so it means that if you think you're destined to be in a startup or to create a startup, make sure that you are fiscally responsible and you've done what you need to do to minimize your expenses and maximize your cushion. Because there are so many things that you don't know when you start a company. So I would think about it that way. What else? Perspective. So, I've been working for a while, and as you get older, really the main thing you have is perspective and a social network, right? So your professional network and your perspective is really kind of all you have in your career. And so you should also invest time in reflecting on what you've learned, because you might work for 1 or 2 or 3 years and then you might be eager to find your next job because either you're not making enough money or you're bored or whatever, or you get laid off. But always reflect on what you've accumulated to date, not money, but like what you've learned and skill and perspective, because that's actually a huge part of your success is being able to talk to many different people from many different walks of life and different industries and be able to relate to them and with them and be able to tell your own story. I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. And speaking about skills and reflecting on what you acquired over the years, what skills were the most helpful for you that you can apply and you applied in Cognixion, in this new company that you established? I mean, new, different from those that you had before.
Skills. Listening is the number one. A lot of people in this field tend to take great pride in what they know, as you should. If you have a PhD, you have a doctor of philosophy, you should be very proud of what you've accomplished. But always sort of keep yourself in check that you're always listening, because we do meet a lot of people that are know-it-alls, right? And they're very difficult to work with. And so we prefer not to work with people that are know-it-alls. So listening is an important skill. Working cross-functionally with other kinds of skills. So I think when you're starting your career, you tend to want to hang out and work with and only talk to people that do what you do. So you're in a bit of a sort of vacuum chamber around what you know and things. And sometimes that's helpful if you want to like move down the route of being like a principal engineer or a principal scientist, and you really want to sort of stay focused in a very narrow way. It's not bad, but if you really want to lead an organization, you need to branch out beyond those skills or relationships that are just like yours. So diversity of who you hang out with skills wise is important, and what you can learn from. I think those are two of the main ones as far as learnings. I think also to go back to, that your entire life you're learning. So you don't just learn in university and then you work, right? It doesn't work that way, right? So if you sort of view every day, you wake up and say, what am I going to learn today? Like I still do that. I've learned a lot in my life, and every day I'm like, what am I going to learn today? And what you do is you end up creating that opening for you. You're seeking learning, right? And so that's an area where you can always, even if you have a bad day or you didn't accomplish what you wanted to accomplish, you can at least say, well, what did I learn? Right? And there's value in
Absolutely, absolutely. I wrote it down. I think it's such a good thing to ask yourself in the morning.
that.
And speaking about skills, and also what I noticed that you really are very mm, I wouldn't say picky, very careful about whom you invite to work together. So people from different countries, but you know what skill set you need to have. You want to have in a company to really deliver the products you want to. From that perspective, what qualities, what skills are you looking in your potential employees? I saw you have a list of possibilities of people to join your company and a big list of future opportunities. So there is a possibility for some of our listeners, maybe even to join your company, but can you tell more on what are you expecting? What do you want to see in your potential employees?
Yes, there are specific skills, and so if you visit our website, I mean, we clearly spell out what those required skills are, and they range depending on the type of job. Our jobs range from data scientists that are working on algorithms. We have firmware and embedded software engineers who are interested in building low-level firmware and operating systems, even down to power management and battery management, other kinds of things. We have software development, Unity development. So if you're doing AR and VR kind of development for applications, we have application level development. We have cloud development for cloud infrastructure. We also have security. So people that are interested in data security and privacy, from the cloud all the way down through applications, through the whole technology stack. We have quality management, so folks who want to help perfect and iterate on things as low level as unit testing up to final commercial testing for product release and software. We have opportunities for on the regulatory side, because one of the devices we're creating is going to be cleared as a medical device. So that brings a whole nother area of interesting skills that are kind of required. So we have quality management, not sort of just QA, but quality management regarding processes, procedures, traceability of each component on the electronic circuit boards and things like this, knowing where things were supplied and where the sources were. And if there was a failed batch of stuff that came from one supplier, that we would be able to rapidly address these things. Design, so product design, industrial design, mechanical design, and engineering for how the equipment, the physical things look and function. User experience design, so user experience design specifically around how do you create an interesting interface that's easy to use that helps people accomplish certain tasks. In our case, it's things like producing speech or composing a presentation and saving stored phrases, or interacting with smart home devices, or interacting with an AI assistant inside. These are kinds of interesting user experience challenges, especially when you're interacting with them hands-free and voice-free. Very different kind of skill. And then we have a general management, so people who want to sort of become project managers, product managers, and thinking more about building a strategy or a financial plan, project managers, making sure that all these teams are doing what they need to do and everybody knows what they need and they have what they need, they do it on time. Yeah, so there's a variety of things that you can do in a company like Cognixion. And I think skill-wise, you can sort of decide sort of what you're interested in doing. Your question earlier about what we look for besides the skills, we have sort of four things that we look for. So one, skills is just it's table stakes. Like, you can't get the job if you don't have the skills. We prefer individuals who have developed a sense of empathy and have a lived experience and have integrity. So we put multiples on each of these other three. So we put a 2x on empathy and a 2x on lived experience and a 5x multiple on integrity. The reason being, if you're engineering an algorithm and you're disconnected from the end user, you don't really know what the user is struggling to do when you're writing that algorithm. right? So your ability to have empathy for the user while you're doing something so disconnected from the user is very important. Having a lived experience, meaning that you fought hard to do something that was really hard to do because it mattered, right? So that could be anything. We have people that have lived experience that they've learned a second language in order to go to a new country because they had to, right? You had people who fought to get into a school against all odds to get into a university without financial aid or things like this. We have individuals who have fought cancer or have been thrown into a caregiver role for an aging or dying parent. So lived experience means that you're willing to do hard things. And then integrity is one where it's really your word. So do you know enough about what you're doing with your skill to be able to say what you're going to do and do it? And if it doesn't quite work out the way you thought, that you're willing to eat humble pie and acknowledge that, oh, that didn't go right, and you can learn from it and have integrity to say, I understand that other people in the organization might be depending on what I'm doing. So if you don't have integrity around what you're doing and how you deliver your skill, it's very hard for an organization to function.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And hopefully, our listeners will pay attention to that. And speaking about the end user, can you give examples of your products and maybe what difference did they make in lives of people? Maybe you can provide some examples and of the technology and what impact it created.
Yeah, so a couple of examples that jump out at me are we have a what we call a Brainiac Council, and it's a group of over 200 individuals with disabilities that are working with us to co-design our product with us. And so some of these stories or these anecdotes are from some of these Brainiacs. One of them who they use a letterboard to communicate. So this individual had a stroke and their spouse used a plexiglass, like an acrylic clear sheet, and had letters like an alphabet on it. And so the way they would communicate is the spouse would hold up the acrylic board and the individual with the stroke would glance at the different letters and the spouse would guess which letter that they were looking at and would speak it out loud. And that person with the stroke would then blink like a hard blink to confirm that that was correct. So you can imagine how long this takes to communicate. And for this couple, they had a large family, so children and grandchildren and things all around them. And once the individual with the stroke tried on our headset, within the first hour of using it, some of this person's grandchildren were around, climbing on him and trying to love on him. And when he was able to communicate himself using the headset, one of the grandchildren had said a really funny thing to him. And his feedback later was it was the first time that he felt human. It was the first time, like, the technology humanized him, because the grandchildren had only known him as a bit of a robot, as sort of a human body that relies on someone else to communicate. And so the extended family had never actually heard this individual communicate themselves. And so it humanized him. Other individuals, we've worked with people that are extremely late stage ALS that haven't been able to speak in 6 months or more because their eye tracking systems failed. Right? Not that the system failed, but their body failed to be able to comfortably use the eye tracking. So they had to just put the eye tracking equipment away and they had nothing left. And so this individual was able to use our system and within the first day was able to accurately say yes or no and respond to yes, no questions with zero eye movement. You can imagine the extended family, how excited they were by being able to simply be able to say yes and no in a comfortable environment at home, as opposed to going to a lab or going to a clinic or a hospital. So those are a couple of examples.
Yeah, those are beautiful examples. And this also brought me to a question of invasive versus non-invasive neurotechnology. This conversation that always comes up at, I think, all the meetings and all the conferences. What point of view do you have towards the product that you are developing? And also, what do you do to make the non-invasive technology like EEG that you are using to work and to deliver what you want, and maybe at least to get somewhat closer to a system that is possible only with invasive technology? So basically improving the non-invasive one.
That's a hard one to unpack. I think EEG has, over time, has been dismissed a bit because of the noise and speed and the setup time and the latency. And so there's been so many factors that EEG has been sort of dismissed for widespread consumer usefulness. There are great sort of sleep studies and other kinds of things that mindfulness or slow wave kind of changes and meditation, things like this, that EEG does just fine. But when you're trying to create a high speed, real time control interface as a bionic extension of a person, it's always been challenging, to say the least. But I think if you look at the component by component, like optimization, and you look at this and say, actually, if you look at how it's been done in the lab, there's so much opportunity just to optimize that. So for us, what we learned early on is it's extremely difficult to scale out motor imagery. Motor imagery is very, very difficult to do, and it's very difficult to train, and it's very inconsistent from a repeatability perspective, especially across different people. Where we opted early on, we said we actually found that using evoked potentials, visual, auditory, or haptic evoked potentials, are a much more reliable methodology for interface control. And the learning curve is less, the amount of calibration is less, and the signal is much more obvious in your EEG data, right? So if you're looking for a specific frequency or a time domain, then we are much more easy to identify what you're fixated on. So that's what we've built the Cognition One headset around, is using evoked potentials and modulating different frequencies, motion and light and sound and haptics, to be able to create easier and faster selections of devices. So you think about a P300 speller, or you think about other kinds of technologies that have been done for many, many years, but they used very crude graphics on a two-dimensional flat monitor on a desk 2 meters away that's wired up to a wet electrode configuration. So there's all this complexity and a very crude, very uncomfortable experience, right? It's uncomfortable to wear, it's uncomfortable to look at, it's uncomfortable to use for periods of time. So if you think about what we've done, we fixed all that. So we said, let's actually have a much more immersive experience. Get rid of the monitor, bring the monitor to your face, get rid of the wires, integrate it into a headset, get rid of the wet electrodes, and design and develop, really high quality, soft, dry electrodes. Bring that computing off the computer into the headset. So be able to connect to the internet, not via a modem, but via a cellular or wireless antenna. So think about that as we've taken the entire lab and we've reduced it to a headset. And we've now then changed the paradigm to where you no longer need to sit in a lab to do evoked potential based research. You could take it anywhere. You could be in a car, you could be in a plane, you could be on a boat, you can be walking. So this ability to take the lab out of the lab is another way of looking at what we've done. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. I was just listening about certain optimization. You were talking about improving signal to noise ratio in EEG. So there is a lot that went into bringing the lab into one headset and making it possible to use it.
Yeah. And on the signal to noise part of that, it's challenging, right? Because there's a lot of noise. And so, but actually, if we look at it and say, well, we can do some very aggressive filtering, but we can also accept that there's a symphony in the noise. So actually, if you look at the noise not as noise, but you look at the noise as signal, then you're getting different information. And if you tightly integrate that with other parts of the system, such as the application layer or the other systems. I think historically, most scientists and engineers that have worked with EEG have been purists, thinking about, I'm going to try and make the best EEG classifier I can make. And it's the silver bullet approach. I just want a BCI to do everything. And we took a more honest view of accept EEG as the state of the art and see if we can push the boundaries of the state of the art of EEG. But we're actually not as concerned with pushing the boundaries of the state of the art of EEG as we are solving the problem. And the problem is more than EEG. The problem is we need to get an accurate indication of someone's intention as quickly as possible. And we need to be able to facilitate a set of outcomes for the user as quickly as possible. And so when you think about it like that, a user with a disability doesn't want to buy an EEG system. You don't buy EEG systems, right? You buy extra abilities to say things faster or interact with things that you couldn't otherwise interact with. And so by making those interactions possible to be able to speak at a conversational speed, not because the EEG is really fast, but because the EEG plus a really amazing natural language processing engine underneath our communications application with a prediction model and links to third-party services, like the whole system is designed to shrink the amount of time for someone to go from intention to outcome. So though we are optimizing the EEG system, we're actually optimizing the entire value proposition of achieving more with less effort.
Yes, absolutely. It makes sense. And I really like what you said about noise as a symphony where you can find actually some valuable information. Like you were saying, it's important to look back on your experience and find things that you can use. So many people just focus on only so called good experiences, but all experience is a learning. Yes. So you can take necessary parts from all of that. And the same here. So, and signal and noise, they all can bring something.
Yeah, what we learned early on too was combining signal sources, right? So understanding that EEG alone gets you so far, but EEG plus head movement or EEG plus eye movement or EEG plus other data, if you can enrich and append the EEG data and tag that data in process as it's being processed, you can do some very interesting things.
Absolutely. Looking at what you said before in some of your interviews, I think it was a talk at Expo at conference, you were talking about taking an approach of making a technology learn from you rather than us learning the technology. That's a very, very interesting and innovative approach. So, how did you come up with this approach and how is it reflected in the products that you are developing or developed already in Cognixion?
You know, it was fascinating. Intuitively, right? Again, disclosure, I'm not a neuroscientist. um, but I work with lots of amazing neuroscientists. So I always thought about this very simply, just the way like you learn to use a tool. So just the way you learn to pick up a pen and you learn how to write, it takes years to learn how to hold a pencil, and it learns years to learn how to write. Thinking about walking takes years to learn how to walk as a child. It takes years to learn how to speak. As you're an adult and you build on these capabilities, then you're learning new things, but you're not having to relearn the fundamental things, right? Your body has already learned these motorically and kinesthetics and understanding, how the body works. Riding a bike, you're going to say, okay, once I learn to ride a bike, then what's interesting is the idea of I'm learning my body, my mind, I'm learning how to control my body while I'm learning how to ride a bike. But the bike is not doing anything. It's just a dumb device, right? And so if you think about most, like the history of bionics has been trying to expect a human with a BCI to learn how to control something that's like a dumb device. It doesn't have its own intelligence. The idea is that shouldn't the system itself have some level of intelligence, right? So that I don't have to do all the work. so that as I'm learning things, it's learning me, and that your mean happens faster regarding finding your balance and finding that symbiosis. And so that's how we've approached this idea that Cognition One has a certain amount of machine learning built in to start to adapt a little faster based on the peculiar needs of the user, whether that's physical motion or lack of motion, or whether that's optics, or whether that's sound, or whether that the context of the language itself. So that if I'm in a certain situation and I'm having a fun private conversation at home in front of the television, or if I'm at work or I'm at school and I'm having a different conversation, that the language can adapt, right? So this ability to learn and make it easier for me to find the words I need to find faster, to interact with the things that I need to interact that are relevant. So that's sort of how we're approaching it. Most of that's in the application layer, some of that's in the BCI, some of that's in so we look at this as a whole system to allow it to gradually adapt to the user so that over time it feels more and more natural and augmentative. And I did want to call out a woman named Courtney Pascal from the University of Washington. She's a PhD there. She had a similar analogy, which is it's not about the human robot relationship. It's more like a human horse. So thinking about a person riding a horse is very much a good metaphor for what we're talking about, because the horse has, as she describes it, the horse has a worldview. The horse understands what the world is in the horse's view. It understands where the barriers are and where the constraints are and what's possible and what's not possible. And the user doesn't need to learn what the horse already knows, right? The user just needs to understand what patterns the horse expresses in certain situations so that you could ride the horse. So you don't need to learn the full horse. You need to learn maybe a dozen patterns of how to interact with the horse when the horse does what it's doing in different situations. So that, I think, is a great metaphor for the future of BCI, is how can we have more intelligence in the system that can adapt and behave more like a horse, and that the user isn't being expected to learn to use the full extent of the BCI and control the machine. They just need to understand a handful of patterns for understanding how to manipulate certain degrees of freedom with the system.
Yes, that makes total sense. One of my questions is, when you talked that there is a big potential and big reserve of knowledge, of innovations that is available right now, it's just not utilized yet. What are those innovations that inspire you and which you would like to have in your products in the future, implement them?
So I think you can simplify it into saying, well, like, there are use cases of our technology or things like it to help restore capabilities or to maintain certain capabilities if your capabilities are declining. And then there's ways of augmenting your current state to sort of level up, if you will. If I think about like what we're doing today, most of it's in helping to restore capabilities or to provide some continuity for individuals where certain things are diminishing. I'd say the future is in the latter too, thinking about continuity. What kind of interesting things that neuroscience and neurotechnology could help with from a continuity perspective as we age or things change? And what are some leveling up of sort of bionics? I think both of the things I hope for in the future has to do with memory. I think memory is very, very important. Being able to more rapidly recall certain memories, the ability to share memories and describe them. Like, how can you, if you ask, hey, what did you dream about last night? You're only going to be able to, with your words, describe just a fragment of what you dreamt about. But what if you could wake up and just, through an interface with like a Midjourney or a DALL-E, you could just render a video of some abstraction based on AI of what you recalled from your dreams. Like, that would be amazing. Or if you said, I'm a visual learner and I'm terrible with names. And is there a way for me to be better at remembering names, even though I will remember faces? no matter what. So I can remember faces from 2 decades ago, and if I ran into them, I would know exactly where I was when I met them, but I would probably still have a hard time remembering their name. So is there something that can help with that? And then leveling up, what could you do for leveling up, which is, I think, having a heightened sense of self-awareness. I think self-awareness in context of critical interaction. So if you think about individuals, say with autism, there's a relatively low self-awareness, and there's a need for external prompting. So pattern recognition around external prompting to say, okay, when somebody looks at you in the eyes, look at them in the eyes. Or if somebody smiles at you, smile back. If someone says hello to you, say hello back. This is quite common in like behavioral development for individuals with, say, like on the autism spectrum. But all of us need some kind of prompting, right? Around like, okay, some of us forget to say thank you, or we maybe are a little too aggressive in conversations and we might need to tone it down a bit, or these kinds of things. So if there's a way to augment our ability to have a heightened sense of situational awareness, I think that would be really helpful for bringing more peace to the world.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And you reminded me about the dream recording. One of my students actually we recorded a podcast with her, my former students. She works on that project, and she envisions in the future possibility of social networks where people even can exchange those dreams that they recorded during their sleep sharing, dream sharing. So that's beautiful. And self-awareness, of course, very important. And even making other people aware of how we feel also might help. It might be bidirectional. For example, Anouk Viprecht, she is making this dresses and various outfits that can signal about how we feel. For example, if somebody is too close, yes, or the person is getting anxious about something, the clothes can start exerting fog, yes, or something like that. So
the spider dress pops out.
a spider dress, yes, yes. So absolutely beautiful. Also, I am very inspired by those innovations and ideas. So as we are nearing the end of our podcast, our usual question for all of our podcast listeners is about doing the impossible, because our podcast is called Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible.
Mhm.
So what was one thing in your career that seemed impossible, but you were able to prove it was possible? And how did you do it?
I think what we're working on now. I had a lot of belief and conviction that it was possible, but most people didn't, right? So it wasn't myself that was the limiter. It was my tenacity and grit to keep going when other people said it was impossible. I think that was the key learning. And the interesting thing now is, after several years of working on this, I no longer have to educate other people, right? So there's become kind of a common awareness of the impact of not being able to communicate or have these kinds of issues that are mental health issues. But we didn't engineer that. COVID happened, right? So COVID happened. All of a sudden, everybody is isolated, everybody's lonely, everybody's feeling detached. And a large number of literally millions of people around the world died alone in hospitals on ventilators, unable to communicate with loved ones. We didn't have to educate the world educated itself. And now, we can sort of focus more on, now that that it's really happening and that it's a real problem, let's move past kind of education and start getting into what is the solution, right? And so I think, last year and this year, we really broke through as a company because we didn't have to do any more of that education.
Yeah, you passed that barrier that you were trying to overcome. Yeah. And how do you approach making the impossible possible in your work? You already mentioned that it took perseverance. Yes, just keep going through the problem. Anything else you would like to add?
Our goal is that 100 million people in the world are expressing themselves in new ways as a result of our technology at Cognixion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you look at that, that's a very nearly impossible goal if you take a very linear approach. So if you say, hey, we're going to build a medical device and have 100 million people within the next 10 years using a medical device, that's crazy. Like really? How are you going to do that? But if you start with the audacious goal and work backwards, then your strategy is going to be different. So if you set a very ambitious moonshot for yourself and say, this is what we're going to do, and we're working towards doing that, then it helps inform the types of choices you make today and tomorrow and next week and next quarter. And so what we've done is we've taken our 10-year goal, we've reduced it to 8 years because we want to have it accomplished sooner. And as a result of that, we've broken it down into a 3-year plan with a 1-year set of key objectives and goals that are managed quarterly down to weekly or sprint level changes down to like daily conversations. So you sort of say, hey, this is what we're trying to do, and how do we operationally get there, right? Because if you don't start with the end goal, you're going to miss it. Right? Or you're just delaying your trajectory to be able to get there. So if you can set your trajectory correctly based on something that you think is impossible, it's actually not. If you create constraints and you frame it, then the world tends to understand what you're trying to do. And if you align yourself with the right kinds of people, employees, investors, customers, partners, media, champions, evangelists, you sort of surround yourself with the people that are of the same mindset, that want to see that future happen. You'd be amazed at what can actually happen to make the impossible possible.
Yeah, thank you. And can you share where our listeners can learn more about your work and how they can get in touch with you or learn about your products?
Yeah, I guess the best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. So if you find me, Andreas Forsland, on LinkedIn, you can Google my name. I'm sure there's lots of videos and interviews and things like that online. If you want to visit our website, it's cognixion.com, cognixion.com. And if you know individuals that have disabilities that would be relevant for what Cognixion is doing, we have an open invitation to join our Brainiac Council, to be a part of our early user testers and others to co-design with us. Like I said, we have over 200 today that are international. So we're looking to continue to expand that. And our website, we have open careers that are available, that are posted on there. And anytime we have a new job that gets opened up, usually you'll learn about it also on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And we will add all this information into our podcast notes for our listeners as well. And is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners before we wrap up the podcast?
My advice to anyone is be humble, but don't be bashful. Carry yourself with grace, but also know if you're trying to do something and someone you want to meet can help you do it. Don't be shy, reach out to them, because you'd be surprised that they might actually be open and willing to work with you and help with you, right? So I sort of subscribe to the idea that the answer is 100% no if you don't ask. Just by asking, you raise your chances by 50%. That's where I've also sort of found some confidence, I guess, in being able to just reach out to someone, communicate with them. So I've reached out to CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and they replied to me within days, and we had no relationship. So if you have the right intention, most people are quite responsive.
Yeah, I can attest for that. And I also invited to this podcast. I'm so appreciative that you responded and you participated. And I'm sure it will bring a lot of value to our listeners and to those who are seeking to get into this amazing field of neurotechnologies and make an impact on our world. Thank you so much.